transmission, and trading of power in the country. And as you can imagine, given that some of our audience here are journalists and people who are not sector experts, our intention is to be able to unpack some of the specifications and provisions of the bill and try to address them as they pertain to criticism that's been happening in the public domain, as well as the implications that the bill has for important elements which also intersect with climate goals, for example, clean transition and so forth. Some have equated the bill very simply to privatization of discoms, and some others are talking about how this will also impact farmers and other communities. And to that extent, we've tried to put together a panel which will try and address some or all of these concerns, given the background of our colleagues today, and I will introduce them to you now. But also to keep in mind that last year, the press release which had come out had said that India has updated its nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC. As such, as I understand, the updated NDC has not yet been submitted, which might also happen very soon, but at least the government has indicated what the NDC will contain. And give or take, it's quite a balanced act at a time when global climate discussions are in jeopardy. India has given relative targets, stayed away from absolute numbers. Yet I think the intention of having close to 450 or 500 gigawatts of non-fossils by 2030 stands true. Similarly, those of you who are following the subject would have also been aware that there are quite hectic discussions which are going on at the moment on what is being termed as the long-term strategy. This is after the net zero goals were announced last year in Glasgow. India has taken up a target of 2070, which means that to establish those long-term goals, there is both a consideration of what we've put forward as nationally determined contribution, which has to be achieved by 2030, as well as what will happen in the long-term strategies on all possible sectors from agriculture to industry. I'm just laying all this out because that's also the space where we would like to hold some of the conversation in the fact that India has shown what the NDCs are. The long-term targets are still in the works, but will be made public at some appropriate moment in the next couple of months, hopefully. And it always comes down to power sector transformation as a low-hanging fruit, which really should enable a lot of transition that India will claim it has undertaken either through long-term strategy or NDCs. And given that, the electricity amendment bill itself is so complicated, I think we'd want to understand how it also intersects with India's international commitments and goals. Does it make them easy or more difficult? How does it interplay with all of those? I'll not give more background, but I'm very pleased that we are joined by 5 of our colleagues who have been studying different aspects of this subject for a fairly long time, and I will request them to give all their inputs one by one. The way we will conduct the session is most minutes of introductory remarks by each of the speakers. And after that, we will try and collect some of the comments, questions that are there from the audience and try to go into the second round. So let's get going. And before I do that, may I please just welcome everyone formally, and thanks for joining this panel. We have all friends here who have been in the space for quite some time, so need no introduction as such, but just the customaries. We have Vibhuti Garg, the energy economist at AIFA. We have Swati D'Souza, who's the lead country analyst and coordinator at IEA, the International Energy Agency. We have Dr. R. Srikanth, who's a professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. We have Ashwani Chitnis, who's a senior advisor at LIFE, Legal Initiative for Forests and Environment. And we have Tirthankar Mandal, who's the head of energy policy at WRI, World Resources Institute. May I invite you, Vibhuti, first to come in and explain the specifications of the bill. Also explain what are the key takeaways, which are the points which are creating difference of opinion among the various stakeholders, and what are the main tenets of something which a lot of media reported on, DISCOM privatization.
Great. Thanks, Aarti, for setting the context. And hello, everyone. Now, talking about the Electricity Amendment Bill 2022, which has kind of now been referred to the Parliament Standing Committee on Energy for wider consultation with stakeholders. But just to highlight some of the key provisions under the bill, the Act has actually proposed to amend Section 42 and 14 of the Electricity Act, which provides for multiple distribution licensees to operate in the same area of supply, which necessarily mean that there'll be non-discriminatory open access to its network will be provided to all other DISCOMs operating in the same area. But there'll be a payment of certain charge to use that network. Now, with allowing for multiple players, this means that there needs to be some rejig of the existing power purchase agreement. So what the Act says is on power procurement and tariff, upon grant of multiple licensees for the same area, the power and associated costs as per the existing PPAs, the existing power purchase agreements of the existing DISCOMs will be shared between all the DISCOMs. So there is some clarity there in terms of how the PPAs would be utilized. And then if there's need to meet any additional power requirements, a DISCOM may enter into additional PPAs after meeting the obligations of the existing agreements. And such additional power need not be shared with other DISCOMs. So the supplier will have the flexibility and the liberty to sign an individual contract, which may not be applicable for others. In case of multiple DISCOMs in the same area of supply, the Act requires the State Electricity Regulatory Commission to specify the maximum ceiling of tariff as well as the minimum tariff for such cases. So it is not that with multiple players that different providers will be kind of having any free way to charge any tariff. So there'll be a maximum and a minimum that will be provided by the State Electricity Regulatory Commission. And as far as the cross subsidy is concerned, the bill adds that upon grant of multiple licensees for the same area, the state government will set up a cross subsidy balancing fund. So any surplus with a distribution licensee on account of cross subsidy will be deposited into that fund, and that fund will be used to finance deficits in cross subsidies for other DISCOMs in the same area or any other area. Further, the bill allows that Central Electricity Regulatory Commission can grant licensee for distribution of electricity in more than one state. So it's not like one supplier is restricted to kind of supply in one particular state only, which has been the case so far. Like you have state DISCOMs for supplying power or having a mandate to supply in one particular state, but now the same supplier can operate in multiple states. The bill through amendments in Section 166 of the Act also seeks to strengthen payment security mechanism and give more power to regulators. So for payment security, the bill provides that the electricity will not be scheduled or dispatched if adequate payment security is not provided the DISCOM. So it gives the liberty to take away the power supply if the payment security is not being met. In terms of contract enforcement, the bill empowers the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission as well as the State Electricity Regulatory Commission to educate disputes related to the performance of contracts, and these refer to contracts to the sale, purchase, or transmission of electricity. Further, the commissions will have powers of a civil code. So that's actually giving these regulatory commissions more power to educate matters related to contract as well as payment security. Finally, there are other provisions, like the bill has made provision on selection committee for SERCs as well as the composition of commissions and APTIL. But on the renewable purchase obligation front, the Act empowers state electricity regulatory commissions to specify their RPO, which is the renewable purchase obligations for DISCOM. The bill adds that the RPO should not be below a minimum percentage prescribed by the central government. And the failure to meet RPO will be punishable with a penalty between 25 to 50 paisa per kilowatt of the shortfall. So these are some of the revisions that have been proposed, but the key ones are on multiple licensees and payment security and contract enforcement. I feel this is very much required as DISCOM finances are under huge stress. So power distribution companies have accumulated losses of over rupees 5.5 lakh crore and regulatory assets worth rupees 1.25 lakh crore. If you look at the property portal, the outstanding payment owed to GenCos by DISCOMs is, in addition to the accumulated losses, another 1.1 lakh crore. And the latest data which was shared by the central government puts the total power bill that is pending from the state government to these power DISCOMs at around 60,000 crores. So state government itself, the various departments of the state government itself owe so much of money to the DISCOM. Now, introducing more competition by allowing more players will improve operational and financial performance of the DISCOM. So far, the DISCOMs have been, getting the backing of the state and the central government. And we have seen on multiple occasions, they have been bailed out in the past. So there's less incentive for them to get their house in order. However, despite the benefits that we all kind of see, which can be made through some of the revisions that have been proposed, this act has been opposed by some stakeholders, including trade unions and farmers and some political parties who want to continue to provide free electricity at the cost of huge financial debt. So the major, I would say one of the things that the farmers are opposing this law, as they feel that with the entry of multiple DISCOMs, this would mean more and more private players would enter this market, and that they will end subsidies for them. They feel that they have been the most affected if the bill is passed in the parliament. Political parties feel that the bill is on attack on the country's federal structure because electricity falls under the concurrent list. State feels that the center is infringing on their rights. So center is gonna have a much larger control in terms of the tariffs, in terms of people who are appointed in the SERCs or APTEL. So they feel they'll have very less control in terms of what they want to do. Trade unions have been also opposing privatization as they feel the jobs will be at stake. While the revised provisions have been suggested for a long time, and I definitely am in favor that the wider debate and wider consultation is a must, we somehow need to decouple functioning of DISCOMs from politics. The revised amendments allow DISCOMs to operate more efficiently and reduce its losses. Some of the provisions that were being earlier laid out but have not been included in the current revised amendment is like the bill is silent on direct benefit transfer, which can address the issue of targeting of subsidies to farmers and even retail consumers with low income, which can be much more, better use of subsidies than providing the blanket subsidies to all. Further, there are concerns that only good areas will be picked up by private players and state DISCOMs will be left with areas with low paying consumers. This, I feel, is quite a genuine concern, which needs much more discussion. In fact, this is something which I have been also kind of, struggling with how this provision can be better handled. And I would be kind of happy to know from other panelists on how they think this concern can be better addressed. With this, I'll stop here.
Thanks, Vibhuti. There was lots in it, and I think it'll be nice to also hear perspectives from everybody on some of those aspects, because those are the ones I think they're the more contentious one, the multiple licensing. And for a long time, I think there was that discussion of, maybe I'm getting it wrong, separating the content and carriage, and having the generating companies and the distributing companies have separate licenses. And if it's a step towards that, then these are really long discussed and debated issues. But I think it's also worthwhile to discuss at some point what's the implication with various kinds of, the political culture on freebies and how that will play out. But just coming back on discoms themselves, and may I bring you Professor Srikanth, you have been studying discoms quite a lot. In very general terms, it just feels that every time there is a blank check that is given to discoms, few years after that, there is again a huge buildup of dues, and it's only a 1 to 2 year solution, and it's not a long-term solution. And given that backdrop, do you think some of the specifications of this bill do address things positively for the discoms? Will they be in some kind of a profitable situation in the future? And will they be able to raise enough resources? Is privatization a good thing? Just feel free to take the floor, and given your extensive research on discoms, please talk about what you think is going on with the amendment.
Thank you for this opportunity and to speak. And I think you recall that I had actually sent out a report and workshop that we actually conducted on 9th of April to bring together a large number of stakeholders, including serving and former regulators, consumers, and private sector discoms, public sector discoms, and all that. So that report is out in the public domain, and I can actually it's on the NIAS website, and I can actually share the link when this is over. So basically, we have been studying discoms very closely, particularly Karnataka discoms very, very in great detail in the last 5 years or so. But what I would actually say is, I think the previous speaker has already, Ms. Vibhuti has already spoken about the key features of the bill. So what I would like to basically take a step forward is not repeat what she has done, because I think that's very nicely summarized. But what I would like to say is that this total bill is a hogwash. Okay, let me, it's a very polite word that I'm using, because actually it does not even identify what are the problems of the distribution sector. The problems of the distribution sector are basically the political interference that is there. But politics is there in everything that concerns human life. I think let us be clear that it is not only India which has got politicization of subsidies. You can also see it playing out in UK in the ongoing Prime Minister elections that are happening within the Conservative Party, within one party. So it's there everywhere. But what I would like to say is the key issues here are two. If you look at basically what the Electricity Amendment Act 2003 did was, it basically actually enabled, and even before that, the 1991 reforms and the Regulatory Commission Act that were passed, etc. The purpose was to have actually independent regulation. Actually, forget depoliticization. The objective was to actually separate the government from the distribution companies and to have an independent regulator. Now, if you look at actually what has happened, independent regulation is a total failure in India. And that is actually because the government has captured the regulator. So you have got a situation where basically the previous Secretary Power will become the CERC chairperson. So this all be same thing happens in the states. It is only the bureaucrats basically who become the chairpersons. It's very, very rare for any other category. So it's becoming a sinecure for bureaucrats. So the whole problem is that we have actually lost sight of the fact that we do not have an independent regulator. And I think this workshop, the workshop that we had on 9th April, we had people like Dr. Pramod Dev, etc., who are very respected chairperson. He has served as chairperson of MERC, Maharashtra Regulatory Commission, which is the largest, and also the CERC. He basically admitted that actually the government control of the CERC is so absolute that he cannot appoint enough personnel in the CERC. So the financial autonomy is curtailed. And of course, basically what has happened, if you see in the last few years, the Ministry of Power has been giving repeated directions to the CERC, saying, do this, do that, I am the boss, do this. Okay, that's it. So I am taking power under the Act. See, the powers are provided under the Act, but they actually, to have some respect, they should be used sparingly. I'll just give a small instance which is shows the ridiculous nature of this direction. There was a direction to basically all the power companies to increase power coal imports. And then when some regulatory commissions, particularly UP and Maharashtra, refused to accept that, refused to pay the generators, only NTPC procured at a cost of thousands of crores, which has to be paid by the consumers. The state GenCos basically didn't show any interest at all, and because they don't have money to pay. So therefore, the problem basically is that the independence of the regulator, it is not, I think Ms. Vibhuti spoke about the federal structure. The whole problem is we are not even following the Electricity Act. The Electricity Act and the Electricity Regulatory Commissions Act, etc., envisage independent regulators. And if you don't allow the state regulatory commissions to regulate the performance of the electricity sector within their state by giving directions to GenCos, do this, do that, do this, do that. So the whole problem basically what happens is who is responsible for the mess? And ultimately what has happened now, that because of the hue and cry in parliament over the rampant imports and the high cost of imports, some of these things have been rolled back. So the directions given to GenCos just before monsoon have all been rolled back in 2 months' time. So therefore, the whole question is that we have lost sight of the fact that we do not have independent regulators. There has been complete regulatory capture, not only by the government, but also by the CPSUs, central PSUs. And let me explain why. They are popular, basically, what I would say, target for all the media is to DISCOMs. Say DISCOMs are mismanaged, hopeless, crap, political interference, etc. But let's look at it one way. We all know basically how much the interest rates have crashed in the last 10 years. But what has happened, if you look at the DISCOM's cost balance sheet, the operations, 80% of the cost is actually cost of power procurement. And I have attended hearings of the Regulatory Commission here, which basically where the DISCOM MDs have said, the cost of power procurement is out of my control. Now, if the DISCOMs basically state, and this is not basically one MD saying that, one DISCOM is saying that, it's multiple DISCOMs, and this is also reflected in the standing committee reports. The cost of power procurement is 80% of the total cost, and that is out of control. Now, if any company has 80% of its total cost structure out of control, then what is it going to do with the remaining 20%? Hardly anything. So the whole problem basically is we don't have independent regulation. The regulator does not have enough capacity. If you look at the vacancies that are there in the CERC and SERCs, they are huge. And this is basically leading to a big problem because the regulators are not able to act in the interest of the consumer. So what you see in the distribution company sector is cost reflective tariffs. Now, I can see this only in the electricity sector. You tell basically any restaurant cost reflective tariffs. Does any consumer basically care what are the costs of a restaurant or what are the costs of any other telephone service provider, etc.? Nobody cares and nobody should. The problem here is that there is no incentive for the GenCos to reduce cost. So the CERC actually, the tariff policy has even made it clear, even if there are delays in the commissioning of generation of power plants, they will continue to enjoy 15.5% guaranteed post-tax return on equity on the enhanced capital because of time delays and cost delays. So therefore, is it logical? Is it basically okay for the regulator to issue tariffs which basically allow the mainly the central PSUs to actually pad on the cost of their own delays in the tariffs and then recover it from the consumers? Now the question is, if this is the way that basically the tariffs are increasing, how can the state regulatory commissions, which have to meet the consumers, CERC doesn't meet any consumer, so only SERCs meet the consumer, how can they actually pass on? So the whole problem basically what has happened is that we have a complete regulatory capture. It is varying from state to state, but definitely at the central level, there's a huge regulatory capture. The regulatory commissions don't have enough capacity to protect consumer interests. And therefore, what has actually happened is, if there is a mess in the electricity sector, it is also because the central government itself has actually given the wrong prescriptions. Let's look at basically UDAI, the most recent reform. If you see the official publications of presentations made by the power minister at that time, it said that basically the UDAI is the permanent resolution of all the DISCOM problems, DISCOM issues. What has happened? 2 trillion rupees, 2.07 lakh crores to be precise, of DISCOM debt was taken over by the state government. So it is actually the state governments now who are paying the interest and who are servicing the debt. But now where are we today? We are back where we were. How much has AT&C loss reduced? Hardly. How much is ACS ARR gap? It was supposed to go to zero. Has it happened? No. So therefore, the whole question is that we have saddled the state. The central government through the Uday scheme has also saddled the states with a lot of issues, a lot of debt. The question is, how are they going to manage the debt? They also had COVID to contend with for 2 years. The state revenues have gone down, and therefore they could actually not give. Everybody is attacking the states that they have not paid their subsidy dues on time. Now let's look at the states. Who is listening to the states? Nobody. Nobody. Because the problem is, ultimately, it's easy for the media to play along with the central government to say states are to blame, states are politicized. And another problem that I see in this electricity amendment bill is that it complicates the whole sector completely. You take something, an idea, which basically of multiple licensees in the same license area, which may have worked in basically in a small country like England, and say that basically you want to apply it in a large, diverse country like India. I think if you can look at, there is a standing committee report on energy, which records the views of various states and tariff policy. And I just read it yesterday night in preparation for this, and I was really surprised because some states have simply said that I am a very efficient state. Why should I basically agree to a uniform tariff with other states who are not managing this sector very well? Every state is not Gujarat. Gujarat is very lucky that basically by its very location, maybe by history, it is by various demographic factors, etc. More than 50% of the power in Gujarat is actually industrial power. And therefore, that luxury, I just studied the data. The next is 27%. That means next is 27% of, next highest is 27% of power in any state going to industries. So that means basically we are dealing with residential consumers, agriculture consumers, who are all basically, agriculture consumers are subsidized in every state to various degrees. And the residential consumers, at least the BPL consumers, are subsidized in every state, except maybe Delhi, where basically even the rich people are subsidized. So the whole question basically is, if the state wants to give a subsidy, let them give it. But the problem what I see is that how do you manage the operation of the DISCOMs? And there I think the state-owned DISCOMs have been very miserable players. And what is the main thing that basically this bill will do? It will make the existing state-owned DISCOMs even more sick. So now the question is, you say that basically you will ride this, they have to share their wine with somebody else. So now what will that somebody else do? They will say, I will pay you, 10 paisa per unit, allow me to reach, apartment association here, which has got a lot of paying consumers. I don't want to give the Juggi Jopdi, Bastis, etc. I want to give to only, cherry picking these consumers. So give me, I will feed power here. So the whole question is, how is this going to work? So what will really happen is the state-owned DISCOMs will be serving the poorest of the poor, and basically the middle class and the upper middle class and the rich will all be taken over by private DISCOMs if this is going to happen. I would actually, and therefore what will happen is, this, I don't know whether the states are going to accept it. That's why it has gone very nicely to standing committee. But the most important thing what I would say is, it does not do anything to reform the state-owned DISCOMs. You're only forcing them to die by a gradual death, a slow, painful death at the cost of the consumers. So what I actually feel is, and this is what basically in our workshop, many of the regulators also agreed, that it is high time the state-owned DISCOMs are privatized through the PPP mode. Many places, distribution franchises are already working, including now basically DFs are now working in even Meghalaya, in Tripura. So therefore, DFs are working not only in cities and towns, they are also working in rural areas. So I think the scope for basically doing a PPP model for various, at least the loss-making state-owned DISCOMs, so they can actually pull up their socks, they can actually start fighting this regulatory capture and start actually talking to the GENCOs about renegotiation of some of the PPAs. I think unless that is incentivized, I think that this bill will only actually make a lot of money for lawyers. Because one thing is for sure, there will be a huge amount of litigation once this happens. So it is not going to basically resolve the problems of the sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Shrikant. I think lots of divergent views as well over there, but definitely what you said on states are not being listened to, the fact that independence of regulators are important, and also, the way you described how CERC has completely taken over what's happening in the states feels like it is such a fundamental issue that it will not be solved in the next 5 to 10 years. So definitely, if we are looking for solutions, we really cannot go back to the basics, because the basics have really been messed to a large extent, literally to the point of no return. But maybe the solution was, and what you really said at the end on, maybe through a public-private partnership model, some of the loss-making discoms can be privatized, and it'll be nice to come back to that as a solution. I also heard your point where you said that what will happen when you open private players to come in, a lot more private players will come in. By nature, they will serve the wealthier customers, and the poorer, low capacity paying customers will still be left with the state discom. So eventually, a discom which is poor now will become poorer in your view, and the private players will come and try and get the cream and be able to just make money. I think this it will be good to discuss that as well a little later. But Swati, a lot has been said by Professor Shrikant, and Vibhuti laid out the specifications of the bill per se. What is your view of the amendments? What do you think are the good and bad things? And maybe in your worldview, how, if anything, is the bill going to help clean power transition as well? Give me 10 seconds. I'm around, but I will shut my video for a moment.
Thanks, Aarti. So here's what I think. I completely agree with what Professor Shrikant said about the privatization. So in 2003, when the Electricity Amendment Act had first come, what it did was it sort of broke the electricity supply chain, and it allowed for entry of private players and different kinds of players. What this act does in many ways is it takes us back to a vertically integrated model, which was pre-2003. Because think of Adani, right? So Adani has coal mining, they have power generation, and they have discoms. And this bill in many ways is going to allow for such creation of vertically integrated entities into the system. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing is not, there is a perspective that India needs more private players over state-owned enterprises. But I think that's a very myopic view of the energy market in India, because I think an Indian Oil or a Coal India does excellent in comparison to some of the private players in the market. So which is why I have some misgivings on this perspective that we need more private players in the market. I'll be very honest on that front. My second issue with that is the earlier amendment in September, not the 2021 amendment, but the 2020 and the 2018 amendment actually had a component for peaking power tariff, which I thought was it was really sad that this amendment has taken away that, because what it would have done was it would have optimized some of the stranded assets that we have in the country, particularly with 450 gigawatts of renewables coming forward. We need more plants with peaking power capacity. And yes, I know that there is an idea that coal will fill that gap for peaking power while battery comes up. But there are technical issues on that front. So some of the gas plants where investments have already happened, with a peaking power clause, they could have done that. So that I think is a huge miss in this particular amendment. And I would also like to draw attention of the audience to a paper by Prayas that has actually analyzed the impact of Reliance and Adani in Mumbai, because Mumbai is one of the only cities right now which has private discoms on tariff. And that paper actually showed that, I think Anne is on this as part of the audience as well. That paper is very interesting because it showed that introduction of private discom does not necessarily mean reduction in power tariff or efficiency. It may mean efficiency, but it does not necessarily mean reduction in power tariff. My third point is on the cross subsidy fund. Now, this is something that's actually happened across different sectors, and it's not a very efficient method because think about it. So in natural gas, for example, when fertilizer sector protested against the lower allocation of domestic gas and reliance on imports, a similar structure is now in place with GAIL as the key nodal agency that then allows an equalization, so to speak, of the field. Does that necessarily mean that the issues of cross subsidy and the issues of efficiency are going to be taken off or are going to be improved? I don't necessarily think so. You're just going to equalize losses or more than profits is my assumption. And it will also be interesting, and Professor Shrikant raised this point on how much of private players will be okay with sharing their profits, and because cross subsidy is profit. From a discom perspective, the high paying consumers actually subsidize your low paying consumers. So how much will private players be okay with sharing some of these with state owned enterprises or state discoms who will have the government mandate of providing electricity to the low paying consumers? And that's just going to lead to an increase in legislation going forward. So I don't want to take a lot of time because a lot of the points that I personally had issues with have been very beautifully said by Professor Shrikant. My only concern is, how does this affect the vertically integrated systems? Are we looking then at, monopoly in many ways of some companies over others? Are there safeguards around this monopoly? Because in the US, it's actually a market, right? You have this kind of multiple discoms for consumers in the US, but over there, the competition is about how to lower your prices. Over here, because the state discoms will have a mandate from the state government to keep prices lower, will we actually see a shift between consumers going from public discom to private discom, or will consumers not even be included in the discussion? These are, I think, some of the points that should be spoken about from the nature of the market, how that's going to change, and from the consumer perspective, and eventually whether it's going to actually lead to a reform of the distribution sector, which I personally don't think it's going to lead to the kind of reform that we need to see in the distribution sector. I'm good, stop here.
All right, thank you. On the vertically integrated, is that not the path that we're already going in? And maybe, you should explain that later, but is that not all the conversation people like NTPC and Coal India keep having? They're also making solar modules or doing various other kinds of things, and ultimately it will be monopolies in some of the other form. But to the extent that this bill can put some safeguards, I think that's the question. Tirthankar, can I bring you in? I mean, you might have similar views as to what have been said, but it would be also nice to hear from you on what do you think can be recommendations to make this bill stronger. Maybe you want to pick on some of the elements that Swati, Professor Shrikant, Vibhuti have touched upon, more in the spirit of what can be done to make sure that this bill actually helps in clean power transition, something that we have taken up and want to deliver to some extent. But otherwise as well, anything that you have to say on something about the states, which are the states which will be better or not good, etc., please feel free to share your views.
Yeah, thank you, Aarti, and thank you, Professor Shrikant, Swati, and Vibhuti for laying out the broad contours of these areas of contention and probably some areas where we see a bit of, if I may use the term progress, or kind of new thinking that has been brought in. But I think there are two issues that are there. One is that there has been a lot of the contentious issues that are there, maybe because the state-center relationships and the control, because it is power has been a concurrent issue and all of these things. We could actually think that there could be some amicable resolution possible in the parliamentary committee, but the key is that there has to be a wider discussion is needed among all sets of stakeholders. That is the fundamental point. And I don't remember how wider was the previous conversations has been in the earlier amendments, because those were also being referred to the parliamentary committee, and the conversations that at least I was privy to was not very open, and on at least not the stakeholders, like the wider terms, the way you can use it was not very effectively used. That said, but the more content specific issue on the privatization part is, to me, is not about the ownership, who owns the discoms, or that is vis-a-vis state versus the private, but it is more to do with about the transparency, accountability principles, how that could be built in, because we have had the examples of earlier cases where these are been kind of been in the namesake for the namesake, when we use the word privatization, or when we effectively introduce the privatization, maybe because we haven't actually adhered to some of these basic principles of this transparency and accountability. Right. So I now bring into this whole issue around, fundamental issue around two macro problems or two macro priorities of the country. One is that you are introducing this bill or introducing these amendments at a time when India is on its pathway to a so-called ambitious pathway to energy transition, and in the context of, we have to look it in the context of energy security. So I would briefly touch upon those 2 points. One is that on the energy security and all of those issues, it's about the reliability, right? It's about the reliability and quality of power, and whatever you already have in terms of regulations and policy to service those things, or to implement those things, whether those are being met or not, like the 24/7 reliable power, USO, and all of those things, whether this bill is actually providing or not. And some of the concerns that both Swati and Professor Shrikant has raised, and also Vibhuti was very intelligently was trying to provoke us with the answers, but I really don't have the answers, because these are the early days. It would require a lot of research on this. But the issue around quality, because if you have lot of discoms or number of discoms serving a particular set of consumers, and the consumers are free to choose, it is correctly pointed out that they will probably cherry pick to those consumers who has a better payment. And we all know that due to the income inequality and all of those things that are already there, not all consumers have the ability to pay for power at the same rate, right? So ultimately, whether this bill is heading towards a difference in consumer in terms of service that has been going to be provided. So that is a big question we need to kind of probe in terms of quality and reliability of power. This is particularly also required in the context that Aarti, you have mentioned that if you look back into the SDG goals as well, we have actually committed to provisioning of reliable, affordable power to all, right? So whether this bill is actually leading to us to that direction or not, I don't really think so, whether that will be met at all. So, 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 so this is one set of issues. And the other set of issues is that we already have achieved that the household electrification to whatever level, but nearly all household electrification. Again, when we talk about in the context of this bringing in the context of multiple discoms and all of those things, how do we actually deliver the reliability? Because we all know that tier 2 and tier 3 cities doesn't get 24/7 electricity, leave alone the rural areas of India. So that's a big question that we need to answer in the context of energy security perspective, right? And if the parliamentary committee needs to kind of do a justice to the discussion, I think this is one issue that they need to take it on a priority basis, that they have to take it on a priority basis. And there are ample literature out there how this could be done, right? So one of the in the context of larger issues that bothers about that are specific to energy transition, I would like to touch upon on the RPO issues that some of Vibhuti and some others have already been pointed out. Yes, there are two issues into it. One is that RPO, the states have been the states already have been in this procurement business for long through RPOs and all. Now, if you introduce this RPO, if you in this current bill, you have the choice to actually make the privatization of these discoms. The discoms can actually choose between a cost-effective power, right, and a costlier power. Now, with these two solutions or two choices out to the discoms and driven by the profit motive, they will ultimately go for cost-effective power. How then these RPO targets would be met? That's a question that we need to ponder about. And then what will be the role of the ACRCs then? How do those penalties can be introduced and all? And then I would like to bring in this context of the RE deficient states. So we all know not all states are RE resource rich. Now, in the context of RE deficient states and in the context of overall energy transition, how this is going to be met? And when you are transferring huge amount of RE from one region to the other region, there is a inherent transmission issue that is inbuilt into this system. Now, whether this transmission upgradation and all of this, the cost that is involved in this, how this is going to be apportioned between the different discoms, who is going to pay for it, and how this is apportioned, those are the issues that we need to actually think on, or else we are going to invite far more mess than that we are already in. Now, the last point that I would like to bring in is about the whole issue about the issue around this. You are actually kind of inherently asking the consumers to take on more burden, right, through these penalty payments, right? I know that they are made for a different purpose, but ultimately the way discoms are operating or they operate, they will actually pass this on to the consumers at the end of the day. And already the discoms are paying directly or indirectly through tariffs and through different measures like buying stabilizers for reliability and quality of power. Then another level of this kind of payments for penalties and all, is it a kind of way to go forward for energy transition in a non-discriminatory way? I'm really still trying to find out the answer to this. And then touching upon briefly on the cross subsidy funds, I agree with Swati because you know, all of these funds, taking Uday, reference to Uday that Professor Shrikant has given, and these funds. And if you take examples of other funds that has been already been created, they work in the first 2 or 3 years quite well. But on a long-term basis, whether these funds are effective to actually provide universal service or quality power to all customers, I have really doubts over it. And to better those things and the problem areas that we just have heard from other speakers as well, I think those are the areas where we need to kind of think to work on as civil society organizations who are working in this power sector business or power sector areas for long, to strengthen it and to engage. So engage it in terms of informing the parliamentary committee, as well as to kind of create that knowledge, informed knowledge as well through our research and all of those things. And I don't think this parliamentary committee is going to take a decision in 1 or 2 sittings. It's going to be a long haul for all of us. I stop here.
Thanks, Tirthankar. I mean, one thing I think is quite clear, that this is really a question of trade-offs, no? And then we have to decide which are things which will go in that trade-off and what are we okay with. And that will be my second round if we don't get any questions and comments from the audience. I do want to ask, given all of these issues, given our own power sector transformation, what are the kind of things that we will have to go through to not make perfect the enemy of the good, but to also be able to at least move the next step? But a point taken on everything that you said, including RPOs not met will ultimately mean penalty for the consumers, and this does not conform to a lot of what energy equality should be about. And Ashwini, you've done a lot of work in your earlier Avatar in Prayas as well, and now as well. And I just wanted to understand, a lot has been said. Would you like to gather some of this, hold this along with your view, but also if you might want to add some of the state specific stuff, like which are the specific states which will benefit or not benefit, implications that it will have also to some states more than others, then feel free to do so.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. So yes, as you said, earlier speakers have already highlighted most of the issues. If you look at it from a state perspective, the most appalling thing about the proposed amendment is the lack of clarity. So before we can even have any discussion further, we are talking about multiple licenses, but we don't know how the area of supply will be defined. We are talking about competition without having an idea how the ceiling and floor tariffs will be decided. And here the government is suggesting that it is to be done through rules rather than regulations, which is a much more participatory state level process. Further, we are talking about resource adequacy and a review of every 6 months of resource adequacy. Now, how do you look at resource adequacy from the point of view of multiple DLs? Because you are apportioning existing power purchase contracts amongst various players. So does it mean that every 6 months, what if my consumer base changes and I enter into power purchase agreements? Who then takes care of that? So, very crucial aspects which are at the root of viability of a given distribution licensee's business, they are left unanswered. They are going to be treated through rules or regulations or policies that the central government will notify subsequently, making it a very opaque kind of a draft to really understand the scheme of things. So the first and the foremost issue is absolute lack of clarity. And the most disturbing thing about this is that the government has been mulling about this change since 2014. So one would expect that by around a decade, you would have some ideas about how basic aspects of the scheme will be implemented. But on those very crucial aspects, the bill gives no clarity whatsoever. Secondly, this entire, I think the earlier speakers have already talked about the issues, about the ways in which the act goes against the spirit of federalism. And so some of the things are really appalling. For instance, transferring matters from a given state commission to another state commission just because if it is not. Now, this is really a very disturbing sort of provision. And one really ponders how at all that can lead to efficient decision making. Bringing in CERC to issue multiple licenses, now that is again a very bizarre idea, because even today you have same companies acting as distribution licensees in different states. Take Tata's and Reliance, for instance. You have them in Mumbai and Delhi, and there is absolutely no reason why CERC should play any role in granting multiple distribution licenses, except for the fact, as Professor Srikanth alluded to, that the central government has a much direct, let us say, influence on CERC than it thinks it has on state commissions. Now that will lead to all of this is a recipe for enormous amount of litigation in terms of jurisdiction, in terms of clarity, in terms of the whole idea, which is at the core of any good competitive process, is to have a level playing field, is to have non-arbitrary decision making. But if the most crucial aspects of the business are going to be defined by rules, which will be formulated and amended by the central government from time to time, what will create level playing field? How do you give an assurance to the entities in terms of their financial viability? So very core tenets of business viability are not really being addressed. Secondly, we don't have a very good track record of holding companies accountable for the risks that they take, be it distribution companies, be it generation companies. The entire PPA related cases that have happened are a testimony to this process. In this context, talking about resource adequacy and asking each DL to have a power purchase basket, which is in a consumer base which can shift very quickly and very rapidly, it is a very dangerous, you can create new liabilities. Basically, I can, as a distribution licensee, say that I was mandated to procure a certain amount of power in order to qualify under your resource adequacy requirements. But now that my consumer base has changed, what do I do with those PPAs? So this is really, a recipe for more stranded assets in the making. Then there is very little or almost nothing in terms of improving or strengthening public participation. So, for instance, the central government wants to establish a monitoring unit within an SERC, but that monitoring unit does not have any representatives from civil society. It does not have, there are no, all the current regulatory commissions have a very poor track record in terms of enabling public participation. And many things could have been done to really improve on those aspects, but none of those provisions are being touched in the proposed amendment. There is a huge issue of access to the appellate tribunal. And while the proposed amendment talks about increasing the number of members in the appellate tribunal, it doesn't talk about provisions such as, say, regional benches, such as the NGT, which would have made it easier for people to have access to the appellate tribunal, apart from the fact that the fees that are paid posed by the appellate tribunal by the Central Commission are extremely high and almost will ensure that prosumers or individual consumers will not be able to really approach these fora for their problems, which are going to be manifold once you have multiple licensees. So you are not creating a framework which is largely focused on dealing with the problems of generators rather than looking at the sector as a whole and taking care of consumers' issues as well. And one more, I just wanted to highlight the other 2 points, that this entire, what shall we say, this entire thrust on privatization and expecting that to help. In that, I think Swati mentioned the Mumbai example, and that is something very important to look at. Although Mumbai is constrained by the current provisions of the Electricity Act, where the distribution licensee is required to have its own wires, and that has resulted into duplication of network. And there are challenges which are unique to Mumbai because of the current act and the provisions therein. But what is most important finding is that all private discoms in India essentially have contracted power with their own generating companies under cost plus regime. None of them, in spite of regulatory mandates, have actually procured power from competitive bidding and through market-based. So this assumption that simply by having multiple privately owned distribution companies will lead to any cost improvement, there is no data to support this, and in the Indian experience certainly does not really support that notion. So in all this context, and with the appalling lack of clarity in the proposed bill in terms of the very key provisions that will define the new shape of the structure and new shape of the sector, it is very sad to see this kind of a draft after almost 10 years of debating on carriage and content separation. So yeah, I'll stop with that for now. And if there are any particular questions, I'll deal with them. Yeah.
Right. I think everybody has at least given their views, and it's quite clear that this is not something which is just all good. It comes with a lot of caveats, and if it has to work, there are many things that needed to be fixed as well. I wanted to open the floor and ask our participants and attendees if there are any questions. Do people want to type? If you don't want to type and you need to ask your question, we can upgrade you to a panelist and you can ask a question. But however is easier, this is a small group and would just like to check if there is any particular questions from the participants.
I think Konkana has typed a question.
There
in
is
the
a
chat.
question from Konkana in the chat, which is the government looking of improving distribution framework or looking for anything like the public-private partnership model in this aspect? Would anyone want to take this question?
So briefly touching upon the distribution on the transmission loss, it's about, look, we all know that if you see the current context, it's about transmitting, be it coal-rich states to generating power from one thermal cluster to the rest of India, or renewable energy rich states to rest of India. There is a transmission loss happening, and below the ISTS level, this loss is much higher, right? So we need a transmission upgradation for sure, as well as the distribution upgradation for reaching it to the end consumers. It's really about the area that needs focus or needs attention is how these upgradation costs are going to be shared under this current bill, right? Or at least the proposals for this bill. So there is, as Ashwini was saying, there is lack of clarity on many aspects. I think this is one more aspects where we don't know how this is going to be bringing in. And in the context of, if you see, if you imagine that there are multiple DISCOMs that are serving one particular area, I'm not getting into how to apportion that area, but at least if you have that point of injection to that particular area and you have already upgraded that cost, how are you apportioning that cost? There could be some formula which needs to be developed, or that something has to be developed, taking in mind that at least the principles of non-discrimination, and so that each and every consumers can access that quality and reliable power has to be kept in mind. So what model we should be going, whether it is PPP or whether it is private or state-owned transmissions and all of those things, I think that is immaterial, but the fundamentals needs to be very clearly established before we actually get into this level.
Can I ask a general question? Because, this was the main discussion, DISCOMs are being privatized and everybody has various shades of opinion on what is really in the mix. Is it good for everyone to just convey in 2 lines on whether you think the DISCOM privatization as proposed in this amendment is good or bad? Is it good or bad? What do you think the issue of having more private players coming in? I'll just go with the first person on my screen, Ashwini.
I think the current proposal is, to put it mildly, disastrous because of the lack of clarity and also because of a ideological position that private sector participation will result in an efficiency when the data on ground does not support that in the Indian experience.
Okay, disastrous. Dr. Shrikant?
Yeah, I agree with the first part of what Shri has just said, that the current proposal to have multiple licenses within one area in the Indian context is absolutely disastrous. Because, and I completely agree with what she said, is there is no transparency, there is a lack of clarity, and I said that this is going to create a huge problem for the incumbent players, because if they have to share their rights with somebody else, I think that itself is going to become a huge problem. And that will result in a lot of litigation, which we have seen in the mobile space also to a lesser extent, but this will be much, much bigger. So therefore, I think having multiple licenses serving consumers, so it is like basically saying in the same apartment building, somebody will get power from, this place. Yes, I know it is working in UK. The whole problem is, can it work in India? And I think particularly what I would like to suggest is there are simpler solutions. See, the whole problem, what I see is, I think as we know, the Hippocrates Oath, when the first thing is do no harm. I think the problem is that this particular amendment is actually going to harm the sector and take it, basically create so much of turmoil in this sector. Not only between the states and the sector, it will be between the DISCOMs, amongst the DISCOMs, it will be between the DISCOMs and the incumbent DISCOMs and the new entrants, DISCOMs and GENCOs. So therefore, this is going to create, and I think, is there no simpler solution? So what I'm actually looking for is that can we do this with a lesser amount of turmoil in the sector? And I think that way what I feel is that doing a PPP model, the way that basically Orissa has done, which was the site of the disastrous whatever happened with the Reliance, there are multiple issues, but basically, yes, let's blame the private sector to start with, because that is a common target. But what I would like to say is that if you look at what OERC has done, then what the Regulatory Commission of Orissa has done is, first of all, when they had to remove the private licenses and take over everything through Gridco, that's a government company, they actually introduced distribution franchises in multiple circles, and these were a lot of rural circles, etc. I know that Feedback Infrastructure was basically had their subsidiary, had a number of these circles as a distribution franchisee. They did a lot of work in basically improving consumer experience, in actually doing billing and collection efficiencies, etc. And ultimately now, basically through an auction process, OERC has actually gone back to the PPP model with, and the only thing what they did is they actually imposed very tough conditions on the entry. So therefore the entry barriers were high enough so that you had basically more well capitalized players entering the fray. And I think one of the main things is, if the regulator works properly, if the regulator basically enhances private participation, and I think that's a point very well made, that I think what economic theory indicates is, independent regulation works only with the private sector. Independent regulation cannot work with government monopolies, because what is actually happening is the regulatory commission head is also appointed by the state government. The DISCOM MD is also appointed by the state government. The DISCOM MDs serve at the pleasure of the state government. They are transferred. They just warm the chair for 1 or 2 years and then they are moved. So the whole problem is this fundamental thing. If you want to safeguard consumer interests, a powerful, truly independent regulator who is empowered to appoint enough staff and not simply basically do the mathematical exercise. Today, many regulators are just doing the mathematics of, A plus B is equal to C, C into D is equal to E. So therefore, this is what you see in the tariff orders, rather than basically fundamentally questioning the GENCOs and the DISCOMs, why your costs are going up, what is actually happening in this. I see very less questioning. So we have got very poorly performing regulators, and a lot of it is also because of government capture, regulated government capture. I think this is something that has to be done. If you want to have better performance of the discom sector, the regulators have to be independent of the government. And the regulators have to promote transparency. And the regulators have to promote more public participation. I think these are actually very crucial. And if these preconditions are ensured, I think a PPP model will work. And I think at least you can start off with some larger, say like Karnataka has got 5 circles, Telangana has 2, AP has 2.
Professor, can I come back to you? I wanted to make this a rapid fire round and just get short, crisp views from everybody, if you don't mind. There is a question in the chat which is directly addressed to you. It's from Shreya Jay of Business Standard. I will ask you to come in after I've just gone around the room, and at least we've taken everybody's views on what do you think of the issue of more private players coming in, good or bad? Swati?
It's not clear whether it will actually improve the efficiency of the distribution sector. I'm ambivalent about more private players coming into the market, but none of the provisions right now show that it will help in reducing the DISCOM losses, and what it will mean for quality of supply and the volatility and energy security. So it's very unclear.
Got it. Tirthankar and then Vibhuti.
So when you use the perfect competition ideas in an imperfect market, it's destined to fail. And this is what is happening in the power sector, right? So basics of the power sector needs to be addressed, or basics of this transparency, accountability. These are the few key things that needs to be established before. I'm agnostic to the ownership of the DISCOMs per se, but if you have accountability and transparency built in rock solid, every type of ownership will actually perform.
Understood. Vibhuti.
Okay. While agree to the points that were made by Ashwini on clarity not being there on how we are defining areas of supply and price ceiling can lead to more arbitration. So definitely the rules of the game should be defined properly before it is rolled out, and also kind of agree, we need an independent regulator. However, a little contrasting view on this, I feel the intent of the act allows for multiple suppliers, and what we are assuming is that it's going to lead to privatization. I think that's not what the act says. It's our own assumption of saying that, when we are getting more and more suppliers, it will lead to privatization, which may or may not be the case. For example, a state like Gujarat DISCOM, who knows how to operate efficiently and have been working in a profitable way, even they will be allowed to operate in other states if they can manage the business better, if they knows how to reduce losses and help DISCOMs to work efficiently. I think that's what the objective is. Sorry, I'm an economist, so I always am in favor of allowing for more competition. I see the benefits because it leads to efficiency gains. I mean, we don't have an established case in the electricity sector. We do, on the other hand. In generation, when the Electricity Act 2003 allowed for more, here it is more allowing for private players and more competition. India was under huge energy and power deficits. By allowing more and more players to come into the market, we saw more supply being created. And at the same time, through mechanisms like reverse bidding, or, when there was more competition that was allowed, and it wasn't just the regulated tariff, we did see efficiency gain. We did see prices going down. And that's what is needed for any efficient operating of DISCOMs, is what I feel. While, again, more competition is what we need, so that, people have an incentive to bring their costs down, to bring in more efficiency. Monopoly so far hasn't led. And it's been years that the state DISCOMs have the opportunity to get their house in order, and they didn't do it. So some states have done that remarkably well. And if they are allowed to operate in other states, then why not? So it's not just the private players is what is my reading of the act.
All right. I mean, it's clearly quite a mixed bag. And because this is so fundamental and elementary, this will have hits and misses. And, quite clearly, each one of you have at least articulated where you stand. I see there is a question, Professor Shrikant, the same question that Shreya has for you, that every time we are saying that Uday is not working and it's half-baked by the center, but are the states not to be blamed for the mess as well? Would you briefly like to answer this question?
See, definitely there is enough blame to go around. So I am not basically exempting the states for, but what I would actually say, the way the media plays up, I think is as if basically the states are committing the original sin. So I beg to differ on that. Okay. So because the states have got a lot of things on their hands, and they have to, I mean, the 2 years of COVID have been dramatic for the states in terms of revenues. I think we have seen all the struggles that have happened regarding the GST compensation fund and all that. So therefore, there are issues there. But definitely what I would actually say is the center has done one thing right, is basically they at least started with privatization of the union territories. See, for one moment, I'm not trying to say that we should have 100% privatization. What basically our workshop basically with a lot of regulators, retired and ex-serving regulators, all basically came to a consensus that you need a PPP model, but you can't do it at one shot all over the country. You need to basically start in some places and basically allow that. See, today everybody thinks the private sector works only in isolated pockets like Delhi or Bombay, or it cannot work where agriculture consumers are there, etc. See, the agriculture consumers, if the government decides to give a subsidy, the subsidy has to be given by the government, has to be borne by the government. The whole problem is how efficiently is that subsidy managed? Are there players who are cornering, who don't deserve to get subsidy? Are they cornering the subsidy? Now, basically, why is it that we are not having metering? The Act very clearly says that every consumer has to be metered. And you have states like basically Karnataka, there are some discoms where 50% of the energy sold is unmetered. The Andhra Pradesh also similar case. So therefore, the whole question is, if you are completely unmetered, it actually leads to a lot of abuse. There are players who are running industries with the subsidized power, I think. So this is a big abuse that can be stopped. So there are many things that need to be done at the grassroots. And I think that, I think Ms. Vibhuti just said that the state discoms had enough time to basically, get things in order. It has not happened. So I think to give confidence to people, I think what the center should do is to have a more extensive dialogue, incentivize basically, at least say one discom in loss-making discoms. I'm not for one moment saying Gujarat discom should be privatized. Let them basically, if they have proved their performance thanks to the high industrial consumption in Gujarat, they can enjoy that benefit. But let's at least start with some larger discoms to either prove or disprove this myth that PPP model will work in large license areas or not. I think this is what I hoped. So that can happen, because that would be the simplest way to do. You have got already discoms corporatized, though they are still completely controlled by the government, state government with a tight fist. So you start basically removing them from the tight fist, allow some 51% private participation in larger discoms like say Jescom or Bescom or one of the Andhra discoms, etc. I don't know well about other states too, but I know UP has got multiple discoms. You take one discom and basically not Noida, but basically do something outside Noida. Take one of the discoms, privatize it. Let us see basically 5 years how things happen. So I think we need to, instead of creating a turmoil in a sector which is very, very directly connected to the lives of the people and to the economy, I think need to do it in a more calibrated manner. I think this bill will create turmoil if it is accepted and passed, and it is not going to, it will create more harm than do good. I think you can start with something different, incremental reforms by incentivizing the states to privatize at least one discom, loss-making discom in each state, and that will be a monopoly in that place. Maybe let us see how that works, whether it is able to bring efficiencies in terms of losses, in terms of billing collection, in terms of consumer satisfaction. I think all this needs to be done, but I don't think this bill is a way. And I think definitely the center has a disproportionate share of the blame, because actually it is actually cornered most of the revenue. So therefore they are exercising their powers in everything, and I think they also have to take responsibility.
All right. I think we are closing. We are nearing towards the close. I don't see more questions, but if I may wrap a little bit, and actually, if we have 2-3 minutes, and Swati, I don't want to just put you on the spot, but is there anything more that you have to say on the point that you made about vertical integration? Because isn't that really the buzz at the moment, where you have one company which is also looking from coal plants to renewables, and more of this will happen as we will talk of transition away from coal to clean. And is there something to keep in mind with respect to vertical integration and with respect to the implications of this bill?
I think, and this is not just the electricity sector. If you look at natural gas, the progression of natural gas or the electricity sector in the US or in Europe or in the UK, we've actually moved away from vertically integrated into entities and broken up the supply chain between different consumers. And that has actually led to some amount of lowering of prices, some amount of increasing efficiencies, to not allow monopoly. The key problem that when we look at energy markets right now has been the rent-seeking nature or the apparent rent-seeking nature of most state-owned enterprises. And there is, without adequate safeguards, I think Tita and Ashwini had made this point, without adequate safeguards in terms of transparency and accountability, there is no guarantee that the rent-seeking nature is not going to be continued by private entities from a vertically integrated perspective. That's point number one. Point number two is, I think, some parts of the electricity market, both, and I'm looking at it across the supply chain, not just on the DISCOM side. We have multiple markets in the country. So, just engineering reforms on one end of the market leads to a disproportionate impact because one part of the markets is regulated. For example, coal prices to electricity is regulated, but at the same time, you want a free market on the downstream. How does that make sense to anyone, right? And because of this multiple nature of multiple energy markets in the country, the lack of clarity in this act is just going to add to that confusion, which is where the entire perspective of vertically integrated entities start coming into play, and competition. And I think Shreya had a question on, won't tariff ceiling prices ensure the look at the arbitration that has happened on both Mundra, both the Tata and the Adani plants, right? Despite having a tariff, despite having an agreement that said that only X% will be cost plus, you're still allowing more pass through than what was originally proposed. So that is therefore a tariff ceiling without independence of the regulator and with politically motivated entities does not necessarily mean that the tariff ceiling becomes a protection. And we don't have enough clarity right now whether this will act as a protection or not. So these are, I think, some of my concerns with vertically integrated entities, to be quite honest. And will a state like, Bihar, for example, have multiple players who will be vertically integrated as compared to, Maharashtra? There are regional disparities that are not addressed as well with the nature of the energy market. So I think I'll stop here.
All right, fine. I think it was just important to get your view on that. I think we can close at the moment if there aren't any further questions, but I will only say that it felt to me that, still, and because it's such a contentious and elementary issue, there will be always benefits of whatever comes out. And in this case, perhaps there are benefits of competition, as we've discussed, on the other side, there are some issues and there is clarity to be given. Like Ashwini said, things don't have to be vague and they have to be managed well. The way Professor Shrikant, you brought out the idea of just making state discoms viable and maybe through a public-private partnership model, try to show, and maybe that's also the point, that the bill doesn't really say to bring in more private players. All it says is to bring in better efficiency, and maybe if one state discom can be shown as a case study of how it can operate in another state as well, maybe that's path breaking as well. And there can be some challenges that can be mitigated along the way. If something like that can also be piloted out in terms of what the options really are. And in the end, for a country which really spoke about energy independence by 100 years of India's independence, and we're actually pushing citizens to think in terms of lifestyle for environment, which is basically asking for a citizen-centric approach for reducing consumption, better lifestyle, etc. The least we need to provide is adequate, reliable, affordable power. And if people don't have that, then it's very hard for people to take action on other elevated aspects in Maslow's need hierarchy. So I think everything has to meet in that sense, because as we heard the Prime Minister's speech on Independence Day talked about everything, and life, what the acronym which stands for lifestyle for environment has actually been included as the third point in India's NDCs to the UN. So, as a government, as a state, we are quite serious about pushing for a citizen-centric approach. And while all of that is not linked here, I think my limited point was that we really also need to make sure that whatever gets formulated is also in the spirit of energy security and energy equality. And you cannot establish also a new regime where you have so much renewables on the system, but then the new power is just coming with the old problems of the old regime. And I think that's also a thing that needs to be checked. But thanks everybody for your views, sometimes divergent, but always useful. And I think that's the spirit of holding these panels and sessions. Anybody who's a journalist and wants to quote any of our colleagues here, please, you will have all their numbers, emails. Feel free to check once before you quote them into any news report. Thanks very much for joining us again, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.